Hello everyone, this is Kat, and welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be Part 36, Chapter 36, entitled Bury Me Shallow. To say Izuku's mood was soured after that would have been an understatement. It was demolished, destroyed, devastated. Any high he'd had from the sports festival, any level of confidence he'd gained was completely washed down the drain, because he was reminded of his failure straight to his face. The hero killer was still out there. In the span of barely a week, he'd killed 2 more heroes, and Ingenium could end up making 3. He'd killed 15 total heroes, and Ingenium could end up making it 16. And it would all be his fault. He'd seen these last 2 heroes die in his head already, just like the others. It was the most consistent his premonitions had ever been, which was giving a lot of credit to his finicky powers. He'd seen all of the hero killer's murders before they'd happened. Every single one. And how many had he saved? None. The thought left him sick, just as the phantom smell of rotting flesh and spilled blood did. He and Aizawa had walked home without a word. Even Gami hadn't bothered to say anything. All Midoriya could think about was trying to keep himself from throwing up the beef teriyaki he had for lunch, and whether that was out of stress, depression, or his mind replaying the way that the hero killer licked drying blood off his lips didn't seem to matter. He wasn't sure what was even keeping him upright anymore, his body practically dead from the lack of stamina alone. He was really trying his best, but the way that his heart leapt from his chest, the way that his ribs squeezed the air from his lungs, the way that his throat dried up from the inside out, the way his eyes threatened to spill over without remorse, he was never meant to win that battle. So that's why the moment that Aizawa unlocked the front door, he pushed past him, running straight for the bathroom, not even bothering to close the door as he collapsed over the toilet and submitted to his stomach. Gami rubbed his back, gently as he lost everything, heaving over silent tears mixed with it all, and even when he thought he was done, he simply didn't have the energy to pick himself back up again. There certainly were many moments where he found himself not wanting to exist anymore, though after his admission to UA, he'd thought he'd been getting better. He'd thought, but clearly he'd been wrong. He sniffled, trying to compose anything left of himself, resisting the urge to wipe his mouth on his uniform. God, he was such a mess. A pathetic, pitiful mess. If the hero killer could see him now, he'd laugh, and who wouldn't? He felt absolutely miserable. Problem child, He'd forgotten Aizawa was there. He'd forgotten Aizawa had seen the whole thing, and that was more than enough to give him the energy to pick him and his broken self up off the floor. I don't want to talk about it. He stumbled into his room, in a drunken spur, slamming the door closed this time quite rudely. He didn't mind, though. He couldn't be bothered to care about anything else as he pressed himself into the smallest space he could find. He squished his body into itself, trying to find comfort in tightness, wrapping his arms around himself to keep him safe. He was pathetic. Why did he need to make himself feel safe when he wasn't the one being hunted down? Izuku, I do not understand. I didn't get a premonition about Ingenium. Midoriya gripped his hair tightly between his fingers, growing erratically depressed. All the others I got a premonition for. Not that it made a difference. Maybe he is not meant to die, then. Gami tried to reason, unsure of what to say. And for the other heroes, you did your best. But my best wasn't good enough. I knew they were going to die, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. Midoriya crumbled. That's good to know. He's a fighter. Ingenium could still die, and it would still be my fault. The shadows closed in around him, circling his prone form like their next meal. He could feel them staring straight through him, watching him, waiting for karma to catch up and dish its rightful justice out. How could he let them die? Why had he let them die? He was sorry. He swore he was sorry. He was trying. He was trying. They didn't care. Of course they didn't care. Trying wasn't succeeding, and he had failed. Sorry meant nothing. He exhausted the weight behind those words. The darkness nipped at his feet like starving beasts. The sharp ringing of metal clanging against pavement echoed through his ears and against his skull. Metallic red splattered from behind his eyes in wet and squelching bursts, and rusty iron stung his nostrils, overwhelming his senses in a sudden wash. Thick, pasty liquid covered his lips, seeped into his mouth, down his throat, and on his teeth. He was choking on it. And yet his tongue, suddenly abnormally long, lapped it up like a dying dog. God, he could taste it. I can't. He shot to his feet, wobbly clutching his chest, ragged breaths, and the edging shadows had flinched back at his sudden burst of movement, but didn't spare their advances for long. They grinned at him, shining teeth, the only source of light, fangs bearing down on his pathetic form. And then all the teeth had merged into one hideous crooked smile. He was smiling at him, smiling into him, repeating one question over and over again. "How do you like my handiwork?" "Stop! Please!" Midoriya swiped a hand in front of him, DT swirling to protect him. He needed to get away, to flee the grasp of his shadow, but with his gloves on, it had no escape. Instead, pulling pitifully at his fingertips, his hand did nothing but claw the air before him. And then the room lit up in a soft glow of dozens of souls. The darkness hissed, retreating back into the corners of his room, the corners of his mind. He stared out in muddied awe. He wasn't intending to summon any souls, but he had, if the mystic radiance of the room had anything to say about it. Had he been unconsciously thinking about it? He didn't think he could have been thinking about much of anything else cohesive during that. Maybe it was his intensive desire for the darkness to disappear that caused him to unintentionally summon the light of other lives. Maybe it was a sign to get on with his responsibilities, stop being a baby about this, and get on with it. The shadows sneered from the corners, laughing at him from a distance, piercing into his chest like the sudden stab of a serrated blade through his heart. There was a reason to work if you ever seen one. "I do not think that you should be doing this in your current state." Gami had to dodge a stray gloved hand as it reached out to pull in a ball of light. "Not that I doubt your judgment, but you might be better off taking some time to rest." "I'm fine. I just need to take my mind off some things." Midoriya waved him off dismissively, bringing the soul closer to his chest. He ignored his mentor's clear hesitation, taking a deep breath before completely submerging himself within the small pulse of light. Immediately he was flooded with a rush of conflicting emotions. He expected it at this point. It was completely normal considering people tended to think a variety of things as they died, but still he wasn't expecting to be nearly knocked off his feet. Maybe he was still sensitive from before. He tried to shake it off. He had work to do, no more getting distracted. Kibe Masahiro, an elegant name, almost ironic considering his profession. If it wasn't out of respect for the dead, he might have chuckled. As he skimmed the surface of his life, he found Kibe to have been a police officer. That had Midoriya sighing in shame. He'd been seeing a lot of those lately, part of the violent uptick in crime around the country thanks to the hero killer's appearance. That smile grew larger from the corners, staring at him with a hungry frenzy. Nope, back to work. Midoriya dug deeper. Kibe wasn't a typical officer to his surprise. He was a part of a quirk trafficking division, who'd been personally responsible for shutting down a massive ring of criminals who had kidnapped and shuttled rare quirks around and even out of the country. The teen shuddered. Nasty, disgusting shit. People like that didn't deserve even an inkling of consideration. He'd be happy to send those scumbags to the underworld without a second thought. He was ready to send Kibe off to paradise just for being against them, much less being a key part of taking down a generational ring. And then he dug a little deeper, and then all those conflicted emotions suddenly made sense. I'll be blunt with you all. 53 million yen in monetary assets was stolen from the hideout we raided yesterday. Internal Affairs has tracked it down to our division, so this is a warning to the perpetrator to turn yourself in while you still can, because if I have to hunt you down, and I will, being fired will be the least of your problems. He wasn't surprised by the voice itself. Sometimes if his memory was vivid enough, he could hear the event as if he was there. Sometimes information he shouldn't have known came to him. It was almost like a premonition at times, though thankfully it was never as real as one. So he knew the voice wasn't Kibe's. Despite having no reason to, the voice wasn't his, and that only left one other reason as to why he was hearing it. It's been months, and IA still hasn't made an arrest. And without an answer, the backlash from the press leak is going to cost the captain his job. I'm worried, Kibe. I don't want the division to fall apart because of this. Everyone's at each other's throats, and whoever did this doesn't seem to care. I thought we were all a family. Midori didn't need to hear any more to know what happened. The soul in his hands almost seemed to dim in shame. He moved away from the memory, floating a little closer to the surface where things were less murky. He refused to acknowledge this sadistic sort of interest he was feeling, but he needed to know how Kibe had died. And then he was rushed with emotions, fear, regret, guilt. There was metal in his chest, blood everywhere, spilling from his hands. He was gasping for air, choking on his own fluids. His partner was next to him, on the floor, pushed out of the way. Shots rang out, back and forth. Bullets flew by their heads. Someone was trying to hold him together, but by the blood just smeared everywhere. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't breathe. He was then pulled out of the memory, heaving ruggedly. Damn, what a shitty way to die. Midori looked down at his own chest, just to make sure that he was still intact. He wiped the sweat from his brow. This never got any easier. Then again, he didn't expect death to get easier. At least, he didn't have to feel the end like his premonitions cursed him with. Just see it, and hear it, and know it. Kibei died a sudden, unsatisfying death, but one could say he died an honorable death as well, saving his partner from the fate in exchange. Did that mean his partner had evaded his own demise, or was it always meant to be this way? Midori would never understand how all of this worked. He didn't think he wanted to. Despite his insatiable desires to protect people, some things were better left unknown, at least for his own selfish sanity. Though regardless of all of that, Kibei still had taken a bullet for his partner. He'd sacrificed his own life for another. That was noble. That was good. He had dedicated his life to taking down massive criminal organizations, disgusting leagues of people that bought and sold others like property. He'd been especially essential in the dismantling of some generational ring. Midori didn't recognize the name, but he was sure he'd find it if he turned on the news. Those were all righteous, honorable, selfless things. That made him good, right? But he stole all that money. He lied to his captain, to his partner, to the entire police force. He refused to own up to his mistake. His silence tore apart his whole division from the inside out. He got away with his crime. He kept his job, but his innocent captain didn't. Just as Kibei had sacrificed his life to save another, he sacrificed his captain's job to save his own. Those were all uncaring, apathetic, selfish things. That made him bad, right? So which one was it? Before, Midori would have found him unjust and sent him to the underworld without much of a thought otherwise. What he did was wrong. There was no question about it, but now he found himself thinking if it was wrong enough. Did the good outweigh the bad, or did the bad outweigh the good? He found himself resurfacing from the memories once again, staring at the flickering ball of light before him, staring as it almost looked up at him, staring as it almost pleaded with him for forgiveness, staring as internally he really didn't know. "Izuku," Gami called out to him exasperatedly. "Izuku, are you all right?" He shook himself out of his thoughts. He didn't want to think about them anymore. "I'm fine, He found himself staring at the same shadows in the corner, staring as the teeth reappeared from the inky black, staring as they curled themselves into a million hideous smiles, staring as they chortled into sickening laughter, as the teeth had chattered together, as blood splattered, as screams echoed, as life faded away. "I'm just going to try another one." And almost quite disrespectfully, he tossed Kibei's soul away, ignoring it as it floated away from him and settled again within the space. He settled for the next closest one, which was thankfully still bright enough to ward the darkness off some more. He didn't even give himself a chance to breathe, diving into these new memories as just an escape from his own, if he could even call them that. Osake Masuyu, a small woman of thin stature, of nothing but skin and bones, adorned in a crude and dirty lab coat. She called herself a woman of science, dedicated to science, taken by science. It was kind of cute. Midori could respect her passion. She was young, naive, and with dreams. She wanted to change the world. She wanted to help people. In a way, she reminded Midori of himself. He sank a little deeper, submerging himself completely in the most important aspects of her life. "This is a lot to take on, Osaki. I know you want to help these kids, but not even modern medicine could help them. They've dangerous quirks, much too powerful for any suppressors. That should say enough. I'm not just worried about you giving their parents false hope. I'm worried about you killing your own confidence. You're a brilliant woman, Osaki. I'd hate to see you burn yourself out and all of these things." They feared these kids, and Midori found himself an upset understanding. Of course they were dangerous. He knew what it was like to be dangerous, but they were still children. He was still a child. He didn't want to be feared, or ignored, or given up on just because he was dangerous, and yet that always seemed to be the easier option. It was never fair. No, back to work, come on. She was trying to develop a new type of quirk suppressor, one that had been attempted many times before, but never successful. But by her designs, he wasn't sure it could be called a suppressor anymore. Osaki was trying to permanently erase these kids' quirks, and he wasn't sure how he felt about it. On one hand, they would probably benefit from having no quirk over the ones they did if they were really that dangerous, despite the rap he knew that the quirkless had. If he himself didn't have such a strong desire to become a hero, as well as have an actual quirk, he'd probably want his gone too. But on the other hand, that kind of technology was arguably just as dangerous as the quirks it was trying to erase. Was that kind of power really okay? What would that entail? To make that decision for others, in the government's hands, in doctors' hands, in villains' hands? Ignoring all that, her intentions were still good. He had to acknowledge that. She just wanted to help. Was that so wrong? And of course he found that answer just a little further underneath. What have I done? I didn't mean to. I didn't want this. It worked so well in testing. It was approved for clinical trials. It was safe. I swear I didn't want this. I'm so sorry. She killed them. She killed all of them. It was an accident, but she still killed them. She didn't mean to, but she still killed them. She only wanted to help, but she still killed them. He'd seen a couple of kids come in the weeks before. It looked like a freak accident, something straight out of a thriller crime novel. He'd ignored the second one, calling it a coincidence, and the third and the fourth and the fifth. He didn't give it any thought. He refused to think more about it, because thinking led to bad things. And now that he thought, he wanted to throw up all over again. He had a feeling how this one ended. A shameful feeling, because he knew he shouldn't be assuming things like this, but a confident feeling nonetheless, because his feelings rarely failed him. Her feet couldn't touch the ground. She struggled, despite knowing how this ended, knowing that this was what she wanted. It was supposed to be quick and painless, but instead she found herself up there longer than she wanted, stuck in her own thoughts. She didn't want to think anymore, and yet she was forced to, as the rope burn seared her neck ever so slowly. She was so guilty. Overwhelmingly guilty. She didn't even want to wait for the trial. She didn't want to burden the families by making them look their last hope in the eye and acknowledge her as a failure, a disappointment. No one would want her anymore. No one would trust her anymore. She'd ruined herself just as she ruined them. She choked on tears, on breath, on guilt. There wasn't a point anymore. She'd given her life to science, and science had taken it. Midori was then forcefully shoved from the memory as the soul in his hand seemed to glow in defiance. His breath stuttered back to life, neck cracking uncomfortably against his spine. He found himself unconsciously grasping at his throat, searching for a mark that wasn't there. He could still feel the remnants of heat, of tension. He had to keep telling himself that it was all in his head, because it had felt so terrifyingly real. He didn't have to look down at the life in his hands to feel the whirlwind of emotions radiating off of it, but, surprisingly, it wasn't what he was expecting to feel. She was angry, filled with hatred for herself for failing, hatred for science for betraying her, even hatred for the children for becoming the center of her obsession, unfounded, but there. And then he got angry at her, because how could she be angry at them? How could she be angry at the kids who did nothing, who asked for none of this, who only wanted to be loved and instead got this in return? God, they were just kids. They were just fucking kids. What did they ever do to deserve the absence of love? What did they ever do to deserve the full cruelty of the unforgiving world? She didn't mean to. She'd only wanted to help. And now 5 kids were dead. He wasn't aware of the red-hot tears streaming down his cheeks until Gami pointed them out. He wiped them away furiously with his sleeve, angry that they were there, angry that he was crying, angry with how all of this had turned out. They never said it was an easy job, but still, there had to be a line somewhere, right? Please, Gami begged in a desperate, uncomfortable way that he'd only heard a few rare times before. Just stop. You can finish this another time. Stop pushing yourself. Midori grit his teeth, the anger he was feeling before now rearing its ugly head toward himself. God, this should be easy. This shouldn't be that hard. She killed innocent children. She was bad. But it was an accident. But she still did it. But she didn't mean to. But she still did. With a sudden, mangled cry, he threw the soul away from him quite disrespectfully and hunched in on himself, unsure if he was ready to yell or cry or throw up again. He didn't want to see her anymore. He knew he had to, but he didn't want to. In a way, she reminded Midori of himself. That fucking terrified him. It grew dark again, the shadows in the corner getting taller, wider, fouler. The darkness consumed all, and yet hid nothing. Smiles stretching, teeth glinting, tongues lashing, laughter echoing. He could hear their voices, his voice, their anger, his disappointment. It was dark. It was too dark. The light was retreating from him, creeping away toward the darkness, waiting to gobble it up like a savage beast. No. He reached out. It couldn't leave him. Come back. He lurched forward, lunging for the light. Tomita Tomotsu, a man with only a gun in his anger. Midori was not prepared. Tomotsu! Tomotsu, what the fuck have you done? Has it hit you yet? The gravity of your situation, or are you too satisfied with the blood on your hands to care? I can't see the man I married under all that anger. Now what am I supposed to tell our son? He's lost his father, too? A murderer, just like the hero killer. And from the closeness of their proximity, where Midori should have felt everything, what disgusted him was that he didn't. There was no rush of emotions, no anger, no guilt, no regret, just an overwhelming blankness, a suffocating indifference, a pure and undisturbed apathy. He almost crushed his fist right then and there. It wouldn't have done anything, but maybe, just maybe, he was hoping it would have. It was then his own anger simmered, settling from disgust. His own fire died down inside of him, leaving him cold and unfulfilled. He knew why people hated because he had hated. He knew why people attacked because he had attacked. And he knew what drove people to kill because he had been driven to kill. But why some took the final step and some didn't, that he knew but would never understand. He didn't want to be around this presence anymore. He was tired, and nothing seemed to provide him with even a temporary peace. Just a moment where the world would truly be okay, even just a second. Instead, he was stuck with this, a token of the worst in humanity. The soul in his hands didn't seem to care for what Midoriya thought of it. It wasn't just trying to justify itself or its actions, but still it pulled him deeper, as one last jab to his heart. We all knew he was guilty. The entire courtroom knew that he was guilty. You have to understand that no one was happy at the mistrial. But just because the legal system failed us doesn't make you judge, jury, and executioner instead. He took our darling. But even she wouldn't have wanted it to end like this, to see her father take the place of her murderer. I love you, Tomotsu, but I can't support you on this, I'm sorry. A murderer. Nothing like the hero killer, but a murderer nonetheless. So then, why did his thoughts suddenly make him feel so ill? He dropped to his knees, unable to stop the soul from rolling out of his hands, limply slowing to a stop just inches away. It didn't bother picking itself up off the ground to float off once more. Or maybe it simply just didn't have the energy. Its light was dim, not from time, but from the mellow note of sadness that rang from its core and infected the air, adding to Midoriya's own. He couldn't judge this man, nor the woman before him, nor the man before her. And who was a death that couldn't judge, a death that couldn't do his job? The shadows seemed to know. The light was no longer enough to hold them at bay, and they knew that too. The teen welled his eyes shut, but his tears seeped through anyway, staining his uniform pants as the tops of his fists had balled into them. His chest had tightened as darkness strangled him, reaching its long and twisted limbs to his neck. He choked on reflex, and the shadows had shot down his throat in response, nearly forcing him to puke. Instantly they were everywhere, stuffing his lungs, writhing his stomach, clogging his ears behind his eyes, filling his skull. He couldn't see. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't feel. Who was a death that couldn't do the one simple task that was asked upon them by the universe? If nothing else, he could at least hear the response. A worthless, pathetic hypocrite. Over and over again, bouncing around the walls of his skull, flooding his ears. He tried to open his eyes, but all he could see was rotting flesh, rusted blood, and that gruesome, monstrous grin. He tried to reach for something in the void, but all he could touch was emptiness and molasses of darkness around him. He tried to cry out for help, for someone, anyone, to save him, but his scream was muffled before it even left his lips. His struggles lost their strength, and he resigned to his fate, letting the shadows constrict him like a hungry snake. He guessed this was how it was supposed to be, and he was passively acceptant of that. What good could someone like him do if he couldn't even help the people in front of him? And then the inky blackness had burned up his esophagus and exploded from his lips, expunged from his body like an unholy demon. He collapsed onto his hands, heaving desperately as gallons of saliva dripped from his panting jaw. His fingers curled into the hardwood, just to feel the harsh scrape against the floor. Every breath was long and deep as it made sure that the air that touched the far reaches of his lungs. The heartbeat in his ears was deafening, but he could hear it. He could hear it, and not the sick taunting from before. It was only after that, after he realized, the frantic shaking to his shoulders. Izuku, can you hear me? Kami called out to him, squeezing his shoulders almost painfully. Should I get Eraserhead? I might have to break something, but that would get his attention. Would he follow me? I don't know. I can. He stuttered on a weak breath. I can hear you. It's okay. Izuku! Oh, thank goodness. He knelt down beside him, running a bony hand down his back, coating his stuttered gasps from his lungs. The ghost continued, but Midoriya couldn't focus on his oddly emotional voice. He felt so weird. Everything he was feeling from before was just gone, like a faded memory, replaced with such a suffocating sweetness he was almost lightheaded. Despite the overwhelming anger, guilt, and darkness that once swelled within him, he felt unnaturally calm all of a sudden. It was nice. Don't get him wrong, just strange. Well, best not to look a gift horse in the mouth. He shuffled, trying to bring himself into a more upright and comfortable position, as well as away from the disgusting spots of spit that he'd left on the floor, and upon raising his gaze, he locked eyes with a small, gray creature, hiding behind the foot of his bed. He'd forgotten that they technically shared a room, and he bore witness to all that. A small pang of guilt had reemerged in Midoriya's heart, stingingly uncomfortably enough for him to wince. He didn't mean to. He raised a hand gently, compelled to apologize, but Lynx scurried off before he could, retreating back to some lone corner of the room. "Izuku, are you all right indeed?" He wasn't sure, but he felt all right. "Yeah, let's get out of here." Gami looked confused. "But Eraserhead is out there, do you realize?" "I know." He was quite punctual about it, so the ghost didn't bother arguing, forcefully putting the rest of his concerns to bed. He picked himself up off the floor, recoiling from the stiff skin around his eyes, the arid taste in his mouth, the disgusting nature of his state in general. The room was a mess. He was a mess. He'd knocked over clothes and blankets in his tussle, his backpack laid strewn across the hardwood with its contents ejected. He didn't even want to talk about the wet puddle of drool on the floor. And that was exactly why he closed the door behind him as he left. He wasn't trying to be quiet, but after years of having to be, he wasn't aware of how softened his steps were, or how his body shifted its weight to avoid creaking floors. He simply walked, and his instincts protected him subconsciously. The only thing he could say he was doing on purpose was checking the corners of his vision in case the darkness from before had tried to follow him, but thankfully it remained trapped in his room. A saber-toothed smile was peeking out from the small gap between the door and the hardwood. He shuddered, but his subconscious kept him moving away, aimlessly wandering into the kitchen, too bright for anything to appear. Aizawa wasn't startled at the teen's appearance, especially being a seasoned underground pro, but there wasn't much that could scare him, much less startle him. He couldn't say that he was expecting the boy to come out of isolation anytime soon, not after that stunt that happened in the bathroom. And while his sudden appearance caught his thoughts off guard, there was definitely an annoyed parent in him that hoped it wasn't to clean up a similar incident on the hardwood floor of the bedroom. "Problem child? I wasn't expecting to see you out here." Although he had to admit he was certainly not prepared to be greeted with such a look of absence, a stare that held absolutely nothing within its gaze, akin to the eye of a man on a morgue tabletop. "Neither was I." Aizawa cracked his knuckles quietly from underneath the kitchen island he was standing at. All right, guess it was time to activate parent mode, or at least do his best trying. "Why don't you go sit on the couch?" He gestured toward the seating in the living room. The hero turned away, reaching for the cabinet behind him. "Interested in some hot cocoa?" There was a pause, some shuffling, and then, "Please." Midori watched his homeroom teacher place a kettle on the stovetop to boil with some profound distance in his heart. The calmness that evaded his senses, it felt so superficial, like a glaze over his skin. He couldn't find the anger from before, nor the immense guilt that came after. It was all just suddenly out of reach, and that should have scared him. It did. So why couldn't he feel it? He didn't notice Aizawa place himself next to him on the couch, not in the emotional, existential crisis that he was experiencing. In fact, he didn't notice anything until his hands wrapped around something warm and the sugary sweetness of the air had suddenly lifted so he could breathe. He sputtered disgracefully, coughing on the desperate cry from the bottom of his lungs. "Sorry." Midori resisted the urge to wipe his mouth on his uniform sleeve again, instead grasping tighter around his warm mug to distract him from all the feelings of spit on his lips. "I'm not feeling all that great." Aizawa narrowed his eyes at him, ever so slightly, but the teen didn't catch it. The pro caught a stupidly insensitive remark on his tongue and swallowed it back with a sip of his own drink, taking a moment to think about the way it had scorched the lining of his throat and the way the steam had escaped through his nose in a draconic huff. "I'm sure I didn't exactly help back in Recovery Girl's office," he admitted with a surprising amount of humility. "I was worried, but that doesn't excuse my insensitivity, and for that I apologize." Midori's gaze shot upward to meet him, and then lowered back down sheepishly. He eyed his drink, watching the surface ripple from the sudden movement, stretching outwards until it was broken by the edge of the mug. The ripples fought hard against the ceramic, but the immovable object won easily, halting waves after waves until the movement had died out completely. "I don't know what to do anymore." The words just spilled out, the dam in his throat finally destroyed after the chips it had taken earlier. "I don't want the hero killer to win again, but nothing I do seems to help at all." Aizawa pursed his lips. What do you mean? Your premonitions have helped Tsukuji and the police to track down the hero killer's movements constantly. It's only a matter of time until they're all dead. The interruption was blunt yet wavering, like the hard splat of a body hitting the pavement. 15 visions, and I couldn't stop a single one. A power as great as this, and I can't even use it right. The underground hero sighed silently, taking another long sip from his mug. He drank hard and heavy, as if it were alcohol in his hands. But alas, it wasn't, and it wouldn't be for a long time, as long as he had something to say about it. As easy as it was to drink away the pain, he learned his lesson that sometimes the easy way wasn't always the best way. What do you think my civilian save rate is? Midori sputtered like before. I don't... Aizawa didn't let him finish. How many people do you think I failed to save? But that doesn't matter, the boy cried. You've done so much good. You were my idol growing up, all underground heroes. You all do so much for Japan without even expecting a thank you. The teacher looked away at the flattery, his heart warming under his skin, but he still kept that hard look in his eyes, that serious stare that came with reliving old memories. A younger me would have to disagree. He then moved to look forward, gazing almost longingly out the window across from them. Midori hesitantly moved his own gaze away from the pro and out toward the window too, and upon seeing nothing, returned to his shell shock. My rookie days were rougher than most. The wake-up call of the dangers of this line of work hit me pretty early, Aizawa admitted freely. Young heroes don't realize that the real danger of this job isn't their own death, but the inevitable death of others just out of their reach. At that, Midori peered down at his cooling cocoa again, and for the first time since receiving it, he took a long swig to force down the uncomfortable truth starting to bubble up. A lot of rookies take those wake-up calls with a shot of something strong at a quiet bar somewhere out of the city. I would know, he continued. It's easy to lose yourself like that. It's even easier to forget why you chose this path to begin with. But that realness bubbled up still, and everything Aizawa said hit like a load of bricks, crushing him under the weight of how unbearably right it was. I know that no amount of saying it isn't your fault stops you from blaming yourself, and I know that no amount of convincing is ever going to make those feelings go away completely. So I'll just be straight with you. He then turned away from the window and back down to him, and Midori swore he'd never seen himself reflected so much in another person's eyes. Heroes can't save everyone, but if we give up, then we save no one. The pro-hero leaned back into the couch, letting out a small little sigh up toward the ceiling, almost like he was expecting someone up there to hear it. Midori joined him, sinking into the felt as he simultaneously felt his mind race away and ignore every second of it. He thought back to what was waiting for him in his room, the sinister smile of 1,000 doubts and fears, of 100 failures and disappointments, of 15 heroes and their killer. He thought about how it absolutely scared him, of how he hated opening his eyes to that grin, knowing there was something that he could have done. He thought about how the child in him so desperately wished that this could end, and how for once the hero in him had agreed. Thank you, Aizawa-sensei. He thought about Ingenium, lying in the ICU, still in critical condition for all he knew. That's good to know. He's a fighter. If Ingenium refused to give up, even after everything the hero killer did to try and make him, then neither would he. His nightmare still greeted him that night, and like clockwork, that suffocating air of peace had flooded his senses, but for the first time since that all had become routine, Midori found himself truly asleep. You are more peppy than usual. Gami narrowly eyed the other with his usual hint of playfulness, drawing the curtains to Midoriya's window shut. Midoriya, who was trying to mat down his bedhead in the mirror, glared over at the ghost, at the loss of light. Gami hunched over sheepishly, but waved and opened up the curtains again with a defeated sigh. Just let me finish, then you can close that. He smirked softly. But I slept pretty well last night, first time in a while. Gami smiled too, forgetting about the bothersome sunlight that was beaming down on his back. I'm glad. Figuring his hair was as good as it was going to get, Midori moved away from the mirror. He looked around his room, to his bed, to his closet, and then back at himself, trying to make sure that he had everything he needed. It was still pretty early, but he liked to get a head start on the day. After all, he had only until tomorrow, until things grew inevitably hectic once again. Gami moved toward him, swirling around him childishly. So, what is the plan for today? The teen smoothed out his short-sleeved shirt, running his fingers down his arms and across his skin. Today was going to be warmer than usual, and he would have been sweating long before he planned if he stubbornly chose to wear his turtleneck anyway. Not like that had stopped him before. But searching through his closet this morning, he'd stumbled upon some of the few t-shirts he had left, and for the first time in years, his routine choice came up as second best. His skin breathed after years of captivity and smiled at him for it. "I want to fine-tune my blasts," he admitted. "Recovery Girl was right. I can't keep tearing myself apart on the field, so I need to figure out how to use them properly." The ghost looked hesitant at the declaration. But it has not been a day." "I know." Midori looked off to the side, guilty. "But I've got to keep improving. I can't just waste the free time I'm lucky enough to get." "I guess." Gami sighed. The teen nudged him ever so slightly. "I'll be careful, I promise. I don't want to keep hurting myself after all." Midori took one last look at himself in the mirror, his eyes dancing from head to toe as he was reminded of his skin again. It was odd. He couldn't remember the last time that he'd left his arms and neck exposed, observing the way that his broken pigmentation peeked out from his collar and snaked down from the sleeves. He rubbed at it with his gloves, unable to stop the self-doubt bubbling in his gut, but while his confidence certainly wasn't at its peak currently, he didn't find himself suffering from the pure disdain that he was so used to. He could look at them now. Look at them without wanting to cry or vomit or some unholy combination of them both. He didn't like looking at them, but that was an issue for another day. He couldn't fix everything at once, but he was making progress. He smiled at his reflection, and his heart filled and lifted when his reflection had smiled back. The teen sauntered over to the window, closing the curtains for good this time, and Gami, who had totally forgotten about the light in the first place, unconsciously relaxed upon being relieved from the brightness. "Thanks." Midori smiled, barely visible in the dark. "It's not a big But the last part of his sentence got caught in his throat as something brushed past his leg. He momentarily froze, unable to tell what it was through his sweatpants. His eyes scrambled to search in the dark, his heart beating just a little faster than before. The small yip that followed instantly had him face-palming at how much he overreacted. "Oh, it's just you, Lynx." His eyes adjusted to see the small kitten sitting patiently by his feet. "Gave me a bit of a scare there." The cat seemed to almost smile at his mischief, pawing lightly at his socks like he was trying to get him to play along. The boy relaxed, albeit still kicking himself for forgetting about his roommate. Guess he was just a bit preoccupied. Gami cocked his head, unable to see the interaction. "Izuku, you coming?" Startled again, Midori quickly sidestepped around Lynx, careful not to scare the timid animal. He skipped over to his bedroom door, rubbing his neck awkwardly. "Sorry, let's head out." The duo left the room as ready as they could be to tackle the world, though as soon as they opened the door, a small cacophony had echoed back at them from down the hall. They glanced at each other briefly, Gami giving the other a sharp nod before zooming off to investigate. Midori crept silently through the hallway, his steps gingerly fatal, his hands tensed on reflex, one just barely under the fabric of his glove, ready to pull it off if it came to it. He slinked into the kitchen, ready for anything, and... "Hey, little listener!" Yamada waved at him from the stove, sporting a comfortably-looking treble-in-the-kitchen apron. "You're up pretty early. You want some breakfast? I'm making pancakes for show." "No, you're making pancakes for yourself," Aizawa called out half-heartedly from the couch, flipping through a stack of papers. "You just want an excuse to make an American-style breakfast." The voice hero had shaken his spatula threateningly, though the image was lost as specks of batter flew everywhere. "Just let me have this." The two continued their playful banter as Midoriya slowly assessed the situation, lowering his hands and losing the tension in his nerves. Everything was fine. How could he have forgotten that he lived with two other people? How could he forget that the pros would get up as early as him? He didn't even realize how wound up he still was from the festival, jumping at every little noise. He released the breath that was caught in the pits of his lungs. Goodness, and it was supposed to be his day off. "So, interested?" Yamada turned away from the stove completely this time. Midori's vision finally focused, only to be met with the lounging posture of his companion floating lazily above one of the island stools. Gami, who noticed his successor staring at him, gave him an idle shrug before gesturing for him to join him. He was going to kill that ghost. "No thanks." Midori shook his head, twiddling with his fingers nervously. "I was actually hoping to head out to Dagoba to train." The sentence kind of died off, but both adults had gotten the gist, looking at each other in contemplation. Yamada cocked his head. "Train? The sports festival just ended." The teen shrugged himself. "Yeah, it gave me a good idea on where I need to improve. Progress waits for no one." "You're going to head out there to work on those blasts," Aizawa jumped in with a sideways glance. Aren't you? Caught in the act, the boy shuffled in his spot. Well, yeah. Those look dangerous, Yamada trailed off, lips curling into a small pout. You sure you don't want to take the day off? One of us can tag along tomorrow. I know they're dangerous, but all quirks are until you figure 'em out and how to use 'em right. The teen crossed his arms passively. I'll be careful, I promise, but I need to get a head start. The pros looked at each other again, eyes dancing in silent conversation before finally Yamada caved, setting down the spatula. Well, you can't train on an empty stomach, so at least grab a granola bar from the cabinet. He gestured beside him and then picked up his utensil to get back to cooking. Midoriya nodded vigorously, racing over to snatch a breakfast bar. He ripped the packaging hastily, taking a massive bite of it off the top before shoving the rest of it roughly into the pocket of his sweatpants. Take your phone, too, Aizawa chimed in, just in case something happens. The demand was fair enough to him, but as he patted it into his other pocket, it dawned on him that he'd nearly left without it. 0 for 3 at this point. He really was out of it. Throwing up his arms in exasperation, he gave the teacher a quick nod of confirmation, kicking himself for having to make an extra trip back to his room. I shall wait for you here. Gami relaxed further into his makeshift seat. Until you are ready to leave. Midori rolled his eyes as he walked off, knowing the ghost missed how he muttered annoyances under his breath. He opened his door to the bedroom, and upon the murky greeting of darkness, he also remembered how he'd shut the curtains, not expecting to have to return, of course. Just his luck, he supposed. It was too bad, at least. That's what he told himself as he wandered around the space, trying to remember where he last left it. He rummaged around his desk, much too prideful and spiteful to waste time and energy opening the curtains again. He shuffled papers and pencils left and right, listening to the ruffle of pages and the clatter of graphite, but alas, he neither felt nor heard his phone. Maybe he'd left it in his school bag. His mind had been all over the place yesterday. He wouldn't have been surprised if he just forgot to unpack the bag in its entirety. He'd forgotten a lot of things yesterday, too. Sure enough, he didn't have to search long before he pulled it out. Seeing its light in the reflection on the screen, Midoriya slipped it into his pocket proudly, pleased with his relative success, then returning the flap of his bag back to normal. Now it was finally time to head out and get the day officially started. He walked toward the door, already on his next train of thought, when he stopped suddenly. Should he bring his whole bag along? It had most of his first aid supplies, just in case something did go wrong. Plus it had his most recent quirk analysis book. If he did manage to make a breakthrough, considering the usage of his blast, it would make sense to take some notes for future reference. Mentally winning the argument against himself, he spun around sharply, going back for his school bag. He squatted to grab the handle on the top of the flap when, oddly enough, he didn't feel it there. Searching lostly in the dark, he found the flap of the bag ajar. Weird. He swore he closed it after pulling out his phone. Guess he didn't. Goodness, he really was forgetful today, and shrugging a bit with disappointment for himself, he closed the flap for good this time, making sure to fasten the button before picking it up by the straps and slipping it over his shoulders. He had to adjust his shoulders a bit, trying to make the bag rest comfortably on his back. Was it always this heavy? He couldn't remember. Had he brought home his gym clothes for the festival? Growing frustrated at his forgetfulness and his terrible pacing of the morning so far, he truly threw his hands up in exasperation. He had no time for this. He was already behind schedule. Midoriya stormed off for the door again, ready for it to be the last time when he realized his aggressiveness. He didn't want to spook Lynx with his own annoyance. He knew how sensitive the little cat was. Speaking of, he looked around briefly. He was pretty sure he didn't see the kitten throughout his relatively short time searching, but then again, he couldn't trust himself at this point. Oh well, he was probably hiding under the bed like he usually was. He didn't have time to worry about that. Closing the door with a soft click, he raced down the hall, gripping his backpack straps to keep his bag from crashing repeatedly against him. As he appeared in the kitchen, Gami sat up suddenly, shooting back to his side. Ready to go? Midori rolled his eyes. Yeah, I'm ready. You done messing around? Gami brushed him off jokingly. No promises. Together they made their way to the front door, though just as the boy reached to turn the handle, Yamada had flagged him down. Hey, little listener, you might want this. A sudden bundle of something was thrown in his direction. Midori easily snatched it out of the air. At least he could always rely on his instincts. He unraveled it, holding it up confused. A sweater. The teen looked back at the voice hero, suddenly growing self-conscious. Was he trying to tell him to cover up? All of a sudden his sleeves felt too short. His collar felt too low. He should have just stuck with routine. He was trying to move too fast. Of course people would be put off by his scars, the hideous way that they danced across his skin. The glaring way they peeked out from different angles as he moved, the revolting way that they seemed to capture the eye and force a spotlight upon the limitless imagination of how they might have tainted against him and the child he rightfully was. "I was just thinking it might be a bit breezy down by the beach this early." Yamada flashed him a thumbs up. "Wouldn't want you to get cold out there." Midori looked up to the hero, back down to the sweater, and then up again. His lips trembled with trailed thoughts, his mind jumbled with fragments of what he knew and pieces of what he imagined he did. "So, you don't... I mean..." The words died upon their contact with the acidic air, fizzling out into steam and heat. "Me?" This time Yamada's smile grew more softly, nodding his head in complete understanding. "Don't work yourself too hard. Call if you need anything." Midori blinked owlishly before smiling a toothy, childish grin. He nodded feverishly, adjusting his backpack once more before barreling out the front door. Gami close behind. He zoomed down the steps and skidded to a turn, pacing slow into a bouncy walk. He didn't want to tire himself out already, but they were still running late. The ghost floated up beside him as he treaded down the sidewalk, sweater slung hastily over his shoulder. Even still, the brisk wind that had trailed up from the ocean's surface slithered uncomfortably under his skin. He shivered. Boy, was he glad to have taken that sweater after all. "Hey, Gami, are you solid enough to hold this for a second?" He slipped off his backpack, holding it out to his companion, then grabbing at his sweater. "Just want to put this on." He reached forward with a bony hand. "Seems as if I am." They swapped for a moment, Midori unzipping the sweater so he could put it on. Though, upon taking the bag, Gami lurched slightly forward, finding his form more wispy than he previously thought. "Goodness, what even is in here?" Gami heaved as he tried to readjust. "A rock?" The teen gave him a glance, pulling one of his arms through his sleeves. "I think you're just getting weak." The ghost flared, the slow wisps leaving his body, dying off as his phantom skin had solidified. "Weak? Need I remind you who's carrying your bag currently?" At that, Midori snatched it back, sliding it across his shoulders with a mischievous grin. "Not so fun being messed around with, is it?" The boy started off again, though not missing how Gami had grumbled, but nonetheless floated behind him, even with his arms crossed. He laughed under his breath, careful to make sure that the ghost didn't hear him. He really did miss this, the comfort of having a companion. Of course he knew that Gami would always have his back when things got rough, but he was ashamed to say that he'd forgotten how peaceful his presence was in everyday situations. Well, the sports fest was over now, and he'd learned a lot, how much responsibility he had over the living now, how much of a symbiotic relationship he had with Gami, how much work he still had left to do. He couldn't do it all now, but it was time to start somewhere. And that's what today was for, after all. Making his way up the short steps, Midori sighed in content upon laying his eyes on the beach. He ditched his signature sneakers while he was still up on the pavement, and then descended down to the shore. Upon deciding on a comfortable spot in the sand, he slid off his backpack from his shoulders and set it down. "So," Gami trailed off, "what is the plan here?" The teen removed his gloves, tossing them gently next to his bag. "Well, every time I've managed to fire off a blast, I want to hear that little heroic facade of yours break." "There's not enough time to scavenge for points. This is our only option." "Shoto, please, I know this isn't you." "It's always been right after an overwhelming feeling of desperation." The ghost nodded. "Yes, well, we've been in some unlucky situations, and unfortunate ones." "I guess that, but that's not what I mean." Midori stared down into his palm, flexing his fingers and watching the clean movement carefully. "I think the reason these blasts keep hurting me is because I'm forcing them out. I'm desperate, so I push all the DT into my hands at once." "You release too much power, which causes the nerve damage." Gami gasped out, the pieces clicking in his ghostly mind. "Exactly," he exclaimed. "So if I'm calm and focused, I might be able to make a blast without overwhelming my hands." "An astute discovery indeed," he praised. Midori cemented his stance in the sand, digging his feet so that he could have as much stability as possible in case the blast had knocked him down. He raised one arm out in front of him, keeping the other close to his side for balance. Outstretching his fingers, he took in a deep breath and thought about the DT rushing through his veins, the pull as it gathered in his palms, the chill as it slithered up to his fingers, the buzz as it simmered underneath the skin. He could feel it right there, just waiting to escape, begging to be released, throbbing in his fingertips like a raging bull, and realizing that it couldn't. Another deep breath. The sensation flooded him so harshly, and he did his best to calm down. He just needed to focus. The edge was right there. He could feel it. It was so close, and yet he just couldn't get his DT to flow over, caught on the cliff so painfully tight that he found himself gasping for air. Ah! He choked on his spit, dropping to his knees as he instinctively was catching himself with both hands. The DT was gathered in his fingertips, and it screeched like boiling steam as it escaped into the sand and turned large chunks of the immediate area to dust. Izuku! Gami rushed to him. Are you all right? I'm fine. Midori waved him off as he caught his breath, pushing himself up and brushing the sand off his clothes. Just harder than I thought. He stood up again, albeit a little shakier this time, and raised up the same arm. Closing his eyes, he tried to visualize the flow of DT, how it traveled through his bloodstream, ran through his whole body. He tried to think about directing the flow to just his hands, to his fingertips. It was building. He could feel it. The rush, the buzz, the itch for freedom. It was right there, right at the edge. But with no escape and no extra push, it was going nowhere. Midori grumbled in frustration, clenching his hand into a fist to try and simmer down the stinging. Maybe the other hand would fare better results. Wishful thinking, because he didn't have any better luck, just the same stifled satisfaction. The boy sighed. I just can't get it to travel into the air on its own. I need to give it some sort of push. Gami crossed his arms nervously. Is that really a good idea? I'll be careful, he reiterated. I just need to get this right. And so he held out his hand again, calling for his DT. The flood rushed him once again, boiling underneath his skin, right on its edge, but just not enough on its own. But instead of simply letting it sit there, simmering pitifully from fruition, Midori instead thought about how he felt, reaching out for Asui as he watched her demise in slow motion, how he felt trapped inside the hands of Shigaraki as he flashed that sickening grin in his eyes, how he felt watching Todoroki lose himself to some terrifying, unexplainable anomaly. He remembered the fear of it all, as he begged for things to change, and the desperation of it all as he realized that he was the one who had to do it. I want to hear that little heroic facade of yours break. He remembered the emotions buried deep in his subconscious, the ones that he hated talking about, those feelings of weakness and regret and guilt. There's not enough time to scavenge for points. This is our only option. He remembered how they made him feel, beyond their surface sensation alone, striking him deep in his very core. Shoto, please, I know this isn't you. He remembered. Please. And then he suddenly forgot. Startled, Midori's eyes shot open, grasping at his chest in a panic. One hand reached out for his throat, just to make sure that he was breathing still. His lungs sputtered disjointedly, choking on the sweet air of peace. He wasn't aware enough for his usual filter. What the hell? What happened? Gami circled around him instantly, examining his body for injuries. What did you do? I didn't do anything, Midori cried, though it was more of a heave than the unnatural way that he was breathing. I was trying to feel the way I felt when I fired the blast before, but it just stopped. He could feel his body calming down, but that only unnerved the teen more. He was the exact opposite of calm right now, and yet his body refused to acknowledge what his brain was saying. He was confused. He was freaked out, so why didn't he feel that way? Okay, no time to panic. He took in a deep breath, actively trying to calm down this time. It was probably just a side effect from all the stress that he'd been under during the festival and subsequently now at home. His emotions were probably just completely out of whack, nothing to panic over. Stubbornly, he raised his hands again. He was going to get it this time, no distractions, just think about the way that he felt before, and he audibly cursed this time, as he actively felt the desperation being ripped from him, and then crudely replaced by an overwhelming sense of stillness. Okay, something is definitely not right. Midoriya spun around, shiftily looking in all directions for something out of the place, but for something that would just trigger his alarm bells. There was nothing except for Gami staring confusedly back at him. Maybe if you describe it for me better, I can help. Wait! He shushed the ghost. Listen. The duo stilled, and after a few tense moments of silence, sure enough, a faint rustling could be heard. Paranoid, Midori glanced around, desperately looking for the source of the noise, but there was nothing but sand around them. Even the stray garbage piles were much too far in the background to be making a quiet enough sound to be heard. There was nothing except for his dejected bag that he'd set down when he arrived, his rustling, slightly shaking bag. Midoriya crept over, taking light steps, even on the sand, to avoid being detected. He could see it a lot more clearly now. There was definitely something inside his bag by the way it was moving. His hands buzzed with nervousness, but he forced them to settle down. He didn't want to accidentally disintegrate the backpack after all. But by the way his heart pounded, he was tempted to disintegrate whatever was inside of it. He was just over the bag now, hunched over as it rocked back and forth. He slithered a hand to the flap, and with sudden ferocity, he flipped it open to expose its contents, and What the? An innocent meow interrupted him, and as wide babyish eyes met his own, realization finally kicked in. Lynx was sitting in his backpack. He collapsed onto his rear, falling back onto the sand as the adrenaline had finally died down. His heart stuttered back to normalcy as his lungs caught up to his brain. Lynx, determined to follow him, tried to worm his way out of the top opening, revealing himself to the ghost that was floating just a ways away. Is that? It is. He exasperatedly fell back onto the sand, uncaring if the grains got into his hair or under his clothes at this point. I think I'm done trying to practice for today. Think the universe is trying to tell me something. Paradise knows today is full of surprises. Midori couldn't help but grow frustrated, lying in the sand. Surprises were definitely one way to put it. Annoyances was another, and what certainly didn't help was the remnants of the sickeningly sweet air that was wafting in just moments before. It certainly wasn't the first time that he'd felt the sensation, but all the times before were strictly at home. Right now, he wasn't at home. If he could be suffocated by the calmness outside of the household, then why hadn't he experienced it at school? The only thing different was... He sat up suddenly, eyes locking onto his backpack. Lynx gave a half-hearted yelp as he struggled to escape the confines of the bag. Link has a quirk. Gami sharply turned. What? And Midori shot to his feet, grabbing his gloves and scooping up his backpack. The kitten let out a startled hiss as his progress was lost and he was thrown back into the bottom of the bag. But quite frankly, the boy didn't care. He closed the flap tightly with a jolt, slipping on his gloves hastily. That would explain so much. I didn't even realize it. I don't think anybody did. Gami scampered to try and follow. But we just got here. And we'll come back another time, Midori called back to him, jumping up the steps to reach the sidewalk. But we've got more important things to focus on. When Midori left his room the next morning, his steps were a slow, kind of deliberate. He was fueled with a mission, despite the empty tank that he was running on. He slept fine last night, but now he would forever be left wondering how okay he felt about it. Was the quality of his peaceful slumber real? Was anything he felt in that room real? Was the space really his own anymore? As much as he tried to tell himself that the potential of Lynx affecting his psyche didn't change anything, lying to himself only made him feel worse. He slinked into the kitchen, not surprised to see Aizawa leaning against the island with a cup of fresh brewed coffee. He stood there awkwardly, knowing exactly what he wanted to say, but still hesitant to do so. He started, fading in and out like the tide. What did Nezu say? The teacher looked at him, not in any sort of malicious way, but Midori still found himself squirming until he eventually looked away. Well, he was definitely interested. He wants us to meet Recovery Girl in her office in about an hour. The teen nodded vigorously, trying to get the confirmation through his foggy skull. Aizawa raised an eyebrow at him. Did you sleep all right? Are you still fine with Lynx being in your room? I don't know. He stared off to the side, into nothingness, twirling his fingers absent-mindedly. How do I know if the progress I've made, the progress that I think I've made, or how do I know if anything I felt is real? Midori crossed his arms, digging his fingers into his skin. I thought I was getting better, but was it really me? Does it count if my emotions weren't my own? I feel like I've been cheated, like it might not be real. Take a deep breath, problem child. Aizawa placed his mug in the sink, then walked out from behind his island. We're not even sure that Lynx has a quirk yet, much less the specifics of what it does and doesn't do. He placed himself in one of the island stools and beckoned the boy over to join him on the other. Timidly, Midori did, making himself comfortable much like a small child would. I'll be the first to say, in the month or so that I've known you, you've improved beyond my expectations, both in your hero training and as a young adult. That's an accomplishment, your accomplishment. No one can take that away from you. Midori looked skeptical. But I hope you remember that your growth hasn't just occurred in this house. You do a lot of self-evaluation here at home, but I'd argue you've grown more at school, with the company of your classmates who push you to be better. Aizawa didn't let him interject. He didn't get louder, he just never broke the pace. Those times, it's been all you. The teen nodded, for real this time, one sharp nod of the head as the equally sharp words had pierced straight through his skull. I don't want you diminishing your progress over this, Aizawa admitted. Just think of it as an interesting turn of events. I don't think any of us saw this coming. Yeah. He kept his hands clamped together in his lap, but some noticeable tension in his shoulders was lost. Thank you, Aizawa-sensei. The hero only nodded, though he couldn't help the inkling of a smile on his cheeks. Of course. Now, I'm not sure when Zashi's going to be home. He has morning patrol, but once he gets back, we'll head out. The front door slammed open. Hey, party people, I'm back. Both individuals snapped their necks in response, Midori in surprise, Aizawa in mock annoyance. There stood Yamada in the doorframe, arms wide open like he expected some grand reunion in his presence. His smile was as bright as the sun, or was that the invading sunlight that he'd invited inside by leaving the door open? He didn't seem to care. Adorned fully in his hero costume and all its numerous gadgets, including one especially new-looking set of sound grenades that were strapped to his belt. Thankfully, Gami wasn't with him at the moment, or he'd be hearing nothing but screeches of a wounded animal that had been denied food, sleep, or some unholy combination of them both. Yamada finally closed the front door. Well, I'm good to go, unless you'd rather me change into something more casual. Aizawa just waved him off. Don't worry about it. I'm more surprised that you got off so early. I've got my ways. The blonde winked at him, following a snort, before turning more serious. Let me go get the pet carrier. I'll take care of Lynx. They let him leave, and Midori hopped down from the stool to put on his sneakers. Aizawa joined him, reaching over his crouched form to grab a jacket that was hanging by the front door. They moved in tandem, with the pro recoiling effortlessly out of the way just as the boy stood up to grab his own sweater. Even off the field, they both moved with such fluid grace, the instinct of their kind of work seeping inevitably into their lives. Midori didn't mind it. In fact, he found the instinctual confidence soothing, especially now when his confidence was rocked even more than ever. He was just fixing his sleeves when Yamada had exited his room, pet carrier in hand. Even with a distance between them, a soft crying could be heard from inside, and the teen choked on the confliction in his heart. Gami floated next to the voice hero, having exited the room with him, and swirled to a stop at his successor's side. I never let the feline leave my sight, just as you asked, the ghost detailed like an operative, but I observed nothing out of the ordinary. Midori shrugged with a sigh. I guess that was to be expected. Thanks anyway. The two adults paid no mind to the one-sided conversation happening before them. Aizawa reached to open the door, holding it so Yamada could walk out effortlessly. He waited until Midori was also out, and the two of them were on their way to the car before shutting and locking it. Gami peeked his head through the car frame as Midori had buckled in. To the school, correct? Yeah, he nodded. Meet you there. Be safe. I should be telling you that. Gami rolled his eyes, though no one could tell. But yes, I will. See you in a bit. And with that the ghost disappeared, not bothering to stick to the streets as he phased through a building. Midori didn't blame him. Why bother with twists and turns if he could just fly straight there? Lost in thought, he was unprepared as the car jolted to the start and rolled down the driveway. He blinked, trying to refocus like a camera lens. The carrier wasn't in the back seat with him, but rather on top of Yamada's lap in the passenger seat. For such a small animal, the cage was quite large, nearly covering up the blonde in full. He guessed Yamada chose to keep it with him, to shield himself from view of passing cars. He was still dressed in his signature look, with his sharp, upturned blonde hair. However, he wasn't doing all too great of a job. But nonetheless, he was sort of glad that Lynx wasn't in the back with him. He wasn't sure he could handle that right now. So, little listener, did you get as far as you were trying to yesterday? Yamada suddenly called out to him. Your training, I mean. Well, not really, he admitted, turning from the window to look up front. I did make some progress, but it wasn't as much as I'd hoped. The boy tugged nervously at his sleeves, oblivious to the way that Aizawa eyed him out of the rearview mirror. He'd been so close yesterday, so close to the answer to all of his current problems, so close, and Lynx had ruined it all. Now he didn't know when he'd be able to go back to Goba again. I know I'm really close to having a major breakthrough. I've got a solid theory on how exactly my blasts work. I just haven't had enough time to experiment. His commentary died off as he realized more and more how much the opportunity had been wasted. Yamada pursed his lips, and it could be seen in the reflection of one of the side mirrors, his hands moving anxiously slowly across the sides of the crate. I know you want to play around with the new technique, but aren't you worried about hurting yourself? I saw what happened during the one-on-one fights. You nearly tore yourself apart. The car took on a somber tone after that, a foggy silence sweeping over all of them, heavy enough to bring their moods sinking down. Midori fiddled with his gloves, and his hands picking at the seams of those gloves like it did anything. He was worried, and that was exactly why he had to. I always understood that people were never going to be able to look at me and see a hero like they do with you, Yamada-sensei. Looking at Uraraka or Ida or Todoroki and just off their quirks alone, they look like heroes, but me? With my powers, who's going to look at me and see a hero first? The pro visibly cringed and couldn't muster up the words immediately. Midoriya didn't expect him to. When Mineta told me that no pro was going to offer me an internship after my fight with Todoroki, he was right. No one's going to trust me to protect them when all I can show for my skill is destruction. He looked away suddenly, trying to hide his glossy eyes by staring out the window. When all I do is destroy myself. That was scary as hell, Midori. No pro's going to want to hire you after that. He clenched his teeth and yanked his head in shame, biting back the tears gathering in his eyes. That's why I have to keep trying, to keep refining myself, that way until I understand the ins and outs of my abilities. I have to keep breaking myself apart until I can stand out on the field and people can see a hero in me. I need to learn control in order to back up the power I have. If they're real heroes, they'll recognize you for the power you undoubtedly have and the potential you displayed. You're here to be a hero, so don't let other people's fears stop you. Asui, or Araka. He rubbed lightly at his eyes, erasing all the evidence. It could be worse. At least he wasn't starting at 0% popularity rate. You were unbreakable out there. Your movement was crazy slick. Midori, I was rooting for you. You're the coolest. And for that, he was more than thankful. I guess I didn't see it like that, Yamada admitted bashfully. I wish I could offer you a backup internship with me just in case, but UA teachers aren't allowed to offer student internships out of bias. Aizawa, who remained silent the entire time, suddenly butted in. You can. I did. Both sputtered and shot toward him for completely different reasons. It's not easy. I had to pull some strings with Nezu. He rephrased after their confusion, never taking his eyes off the road. But I'm offering a student an internship this year. I'm sure with the right wording, Nezu would allow you to do the same. The difficulty of that right wording went unsaid, but the point still stood. Yamada beamed excitedly, though the mirror at the prospect. This is great, little listener. I can go talk to Nezu. With a little persuading, I'm sure. No, Midoriya stated firmly before catching himself. No, thank you. Yamada looked confused, instinctively turning his head around to try and look at him directly. But wouldn't you want... I made my choices during the sports festival, and my performance was what it was, the teen admitted truthfully. My internship opportunity should reflect that. It's only fair to my classmates who work just as hard for their same chances. Another pause echoed around the car, reverberating off of the metal frame like a loose cannon. That was very mature of you, Midoriya, Aizawa chirped from the driver's seat. I'm sure everything will work out just fine one way or another. He nodded. Thank you, Aizawa-sensei. The engine hummed into silence as the boy lurched forward with the stop of the vehicle. Aizawa roughly put it into park and wasted no time stepping out of the car, with the two others following close behind. They didn't bother going through the front entrance when both Aizawa and Yamada owned an all-access key. He scanned them all in, and the group made their way through a side entrance into the building. Any conversation before ebbed away into nothingness as Midoriya trailed behind, awkwardly. He couldn't find the confidence to walk beside the two teachers, not with Lynx so dangerously close, even in the crate. He knew he was probably over-exaggerating, but there was something about the invasion that was so uncomfortable. It left him so uneasy, to think that there was some part of him that had been tampered with. Well, hopefully this would clear up some things. He'd like to actually have a shot at decent sleep. Boo. Fuck! Midoriya jumped out of his skin and outstretched his hand despite his glove being on, only to meet the mischievous stare of his ghostly mentor. He grasped at his chest, trying to calm his racing heart with a rough exhale. What the hell, Gami? The teachers calmed upon understanding and continued to set the pace toward Recovery Girl's office. Gami shrugged in response. You were taking a while. I got bored. The teen grumbled under his breath, but didn't have the heart to stay mad at him. I'm not even going to give you the satisfaction of a response. Come on, at least to entertain me a little. Not at the expense of my... You two. Aizawa looked over his shoulder, and that's when the duo consciously realized that they had all stopped. We're here. Embarrassed, they both instantly silenced and followed obediently as Aizawa held the door open for them all. Of course, both Nezu and Recovery Girl were already inside, beckoning them in impatiently. Midoriya swallowed roughly. He hoped that neither had been waiting long. One was a sadistic rat for a principal that he simultaneously both respected and feared, and the other was a matronly veteran that had already been pissed off by him way too many times for the short period that he'd known her. The last thing he wanted on his supposed day off was to deal with either of their petty vengefulness. Ah, Aizawa-san, Yamada-san, Midoriya. Nezu clasped his paws together in such an endearing way it was sickening. Nice of you to finally join us. Aizawa rolled his eyes. We're here early." "Time is relative, though, to the eyes it is viewed from," Nezu batted back. "Though we've wasted enough of it already, let's get started." Recovery Girl, who had been watching from the sidelines as of yet, patted one of her cots. "Why don't you set that little carrier here? I'll get my things." Yamada complied, setting down the crate gently so as to not startle the kitten inside. He slowly undid the latch, holding it closed, and allowed the grated door to swing open. He backed away from the cot. A second passed by. A second more. The longest second in eternity. And then Lynx cautiously peeked out from the carrier opening, veering his head from side to side as he eyed the array of people. Midori held his breath. Nobody dared make a move, lest they risk the cat being startled. Still, the feline eyed them all with suspicion, making no move to leave the relative safety of the crate. Midori couldn't really blame him. Nezu could no longer hold back his excitement, taking a confident step forward with his paws out. "Hi there, I'm Nezu. Who might you be?" Lynx shrinked further into the crate, but still kept most of his head out. He locked his gaze on the rodent, who, in turn, took the continued presence as a sign of approval. My, you're quite responsive, aren't you? I bet you know exactly what's going on." The kitten took a more confident step out of the carrier, toward the direction that Nezu was in, and that was when Recovery Girl removed the crate from the cot, leaving him startled as his only source of protection was taken. He scrunched in on himself, much like Midori was doing now, edging his way to the wall of the office in an attempt to protect himself from behind. Gami was the only one who noticed. "Hey, take a breath. Nothing can hurt you." I know, but so why? Why did he find himself so uneasy around the cat now? So much more than before. Did the prospect of some emotional invasion really bother him so? Or was it the fact that he could no longer trust his feelings any more? The fact that his peace might be fake? Gami wasn't the only one who noticed Midori's existential crisis, despite all visuals saying otherwise. Gami wasn't the only one who noticed his successor's short, quiet breaths, or the way that he'd curled in on his own body to make himself seem smaller, or the thundering of his heartbeat echoing from his ribcage as nothing seemed to make sense anymore. Gami wasn't the only one who noticed. He never was. Lynx suddenly sat himself comfortably down, and everyone in the room could almost swear that he smiled up at them. The air was smothered in the disgustingly sugary smell of calmness. Recovery Girl took a step back. "Well, that's certainly evidence of a quirk if I've seen one." "Very peaceful," Nezu hummed. "You seem to have a strong emitter quirk, my friend." Aizawa and Yamada, who had neither ever experienced even an extent of Lynx's hidden potential, stood in awe as tranquility swirled in their gut, witness to a marvelous phenomenon of miracles. Everyone took in their first experience like a breath of fresh mountainside air, clean and pure like the first fallings of snow. Midori took in this routine experience like the slow burn of a horror film, desperate for it to all end. His lungs tightened instinctively, trying to force the foreign emotion from his bloodstream, but he only succeeded in choking himself out. His brain wailed with alarms, and as much as he tried to remember that he wasn't alone this time, that did nothing to quell the surge of red flags, he needed out. He needed out right now. His frantic eyes fell upon the door that they'd entered in, and his mind exploded with the prospect of relief. He stumbled, like a toddler, using his walls to balance his shaky footing, and he snaked behind the adults. His panicky movements trumped his sneaky instincts, and his shuffling was far too loud to go unnoticed by more than just Gami and Lynx. Midori didn't stop at the calls of his name. In fact, he couldn't even hear them. All he could hear was a soft buzzing in his ears, the echo that reverberated in his brain and commanded him to still, but he couldn't. Its oxymoronic presence tore any semblance of reason from his thoughts. He fumbled with the handle, but he couldn't open the door. He couldn't open the door. He couldn't open the door. Someone help him. Open the door. Something, a pleasant wind, scooped him up and twisted open the door, carrying him to safety as his consciousness had cried out in gratitude. He didn't even think. He wasn't sure he could any more. He just grabbed that ripped dark fabric that he knew was waiting for him and buried the shameful look that he knew was plastered on his face. He buried his dry heaves, his trembling eyes. His reservoir of emotions finally allowed him to resurface. He buried it all in his mentor's cloak. It wasn't really all that different from how he was in that room just before. Gami hugged him back. The embrace with him, it was all the same level of intensity as the deft grip on his robe, with the silent promise of deafening certainty that he would always keep him safe. That was the difference. Neither of them cared that the door was still open. It was quite possible that neither of them noticed. That was until Aizawa stepped out to close it. Midori didn't want anyone to see him. He just wanted to cry his eyes out until he had such a headache that he couldn't hear himself think any more. But he only did that when he was alone, and that was why Midoriya didn't want anyone to see him. Midoriya. He didn't want Aizawa to see him like this. You could have told me, if Lynx was affecting you this much. How was he supposed to know? Never mind. He should have known. He should have been able to put the pieces together. He had his suspicions from the beginning. He should have just done everything right. Midoriya, I won't ask you to talk to me if you don't. Please. I'm sorry. Why was he begging? I'm not. You don't have to apologize. He didn't deserve the consideration. I didn't know. I thought I could handle it. Who would even listen? What? His quirk? I don't really have the full picture. He locks me away in my own body, Midoriya snapped. I know how I'm supposed to feel, but I can't feel it. Whenever I'm angry or sad, he pushes it down and locks it away and forces me to be calm, but it's not real. I know how I'm supposed to feel. I know how I want to feel, but he just slaps a coat of that disgusting feeling all over it until I can't remember where I started in the first place. He can't take that from me. It's not fair. He's not helping. By the end, Midoriya was shaking uncontrollably. Having pried himself from Gami's arms, he had his own arms wrapped around himself, violent tears brewing in the corners of his eyes, though he held them back with such a force that it could rival the greatest natural disasters. The only relative sense of goodness that he could find within it all was the freedom of feeling the way that he did right now. He was angry, and he could feel it. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. The door opened, and nobody moved. Nobody dared make a move as Yamada cautiously stuck his head out of the small gap. Nobody dared make a move as the silent ambience had revealed itself. Nobody dared make a move when the sweetness snaked out from the crack ever so slowly. I don't mean to interrupt, the normally vocal hero stuttered out quite unconfidently, choking on the tension second-handed. I just thought you might want to know. Midoriya didn't dare make a fucking move. Recovery Girl's preliminary diagnosis is that Lynx does have some kind of emotionally invasive quirk. All right, everyone. This concludes Chapter 36 of Deku and Death. Chapter 37 will be next. I hope you all are still enjoying this one. As always, thank you so much for listening.